My name is Benjamin Foster. This happened 3 summers ago when I was 21. A couple of friends and I rented a cabin near Lake Cumberland in Kentucky for a long weekend. It wasn't anything fancy. The place was old, smelled vaguely like mildew, and had furniture that looked like it hadn't been replaced since the early 2000s. But it was right on the water, cheap, and far away from everything else. There were 4 of us: me, Ryan, Mason, and Caleb. The cabin sat on a wooded stretch of shoreline with only a few neighboring properties scattered along the lake. Most of them looked vacant. The first 2 days were exactly what you'd expect from a summer vacation. Swimming during the day, grilling at night, drinking a few beers on the deck, and talking about stupid things we'd done in college. Nothing unusual. On the 3rd afternoon, we decided to take a small rental boat out onto the lake. The weather was perfect. Not too hot, hardly any wind. We spent a few hours fishing and exploring random coves we'd never seen before. Around late afternoon, Ryan spotted something along the shoreline. It was a small wooden dock tucked between thick trees. At first, there was nothing strange about it. The lake was full of private docks. But the longer we looked, the weirder it seemed. There wasn't a house attached to it, no cabin, no road, nothing. Just a dock sitting by itself in the middle of the woods. We slowly drifted closer. There were several fuel cans stacked neatly near the shore, a few coolers, some ropes, a tarp covering something large. It looked like someone was actively using the place. But for what, we had no idea. We joked that maybe it was some secret fishing spot. Ryan wanted to get closer. Mason thought it was a bad idea. Eventually, we left and continued exploring. Honestly, I forgot about it for a while. As the sun started getting lower, we headed back toward the cabin. To get there, we had to pass the same stretch of shoreline again. That's when we noticed a boat tied up at the dock. A small aluminum fishing boat. There hadn't been one there earlier, and there were 3 men standing on the dock. Even from a distance, I could tell they were watching us. Nobody waved. Nobody went back to what they were doing. They just stood there looking at us the entire time we passed. I remember feeling uncomfortable, but not scared. At least not yet. When we got back to the cabin, we mentioned it a few times and laughed about how creepy it felt. Ryan joked that we'd probably interrupted somebody's moonshine operation. By that night, we'd mostly forgotten about it. Around midnight, we were sitting on the deck when Caleb suddenly stopped talking. He was staring out toward the water. I asked what was wrong. He pointed toward the lake. There was a boat out there, not moving, just sitting. The navigation lights were off. At first I thought he was imagining things. Then I saw it too. A dark shape floating maybe 100 yards from shore. It was difficult to make out details, but it was definitely a boat. We watched it for several minutes. Nobody aboard used a flashlight. Nobody spoke. Eventually, it drifted away into the darkness. We all agreed it was weird. Then we went to bed. The next morning, I woke up before everyone else. I made coffee and stepped outside. That's when I noticed footprints. They were in the damp dirt below the deck. Fresh footprints, leading from the shoreline toward the cabin, and then back toward the shoreline again. At first, I assumed they belonged to one of us. But when everyone woke up, nobody claimed to have gone outside during the night. The footprints weren't proof of anything. People walked around the lake all the time. Still, it bothered me, especially after what we'd seen. That afternoon, we drove into town for lunch. When we returned, Ryan noticed something near the side of the cabin, an empty beer can. not one of ours. Different brand, still cold. We started making jokes again, because that's what people do when they're uncomfortable. But nobody seemed completely convinced. That night, we locked every door. Not because we genuinely thought we were in danger, just because it felt like the smart thing to do. Around 2 a.m., I woke up needing to use the bathroom. As I walked past the living room window, I happened to glance outside and froze. There was somebody standing near the tree line. I couldn't make out a face, only a silhouette, completely motionless, looking toward the cabin. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I might still be half asleep. Then the figure turned and disappeared into the woods. I immediately woke everyone up. Ryan grabbed a flashlight. We checked outside. Nothing. No person. No boat. No sounds. Just darkness. The next morning, nobody wanted to stay another night. We packed up and left several hours earlier than planned. Before leaving, I mentioned everything to the property owner. The dock, the boat, the footprints, the figure. At first he didn't say much. Then he asked where exactly we'd seen the dock. I showed him on a map. His expression changed immediately. He got quiet for a second and then said something I'll never forget. He said, "You boys should have stayed away from that area." I asked why. He just shrugged and said, people had complained about unusual activity there for years. Fishing after dark, boats coming and going at odd hours, strangers showing up on private property. Nothing serious enough for police to act on, but enough that locals avoided that part of the lake. To this day, I have no idea who those men were. Maybe they were doing something illegal. Maybe they were just trying to protect whatever they had hidden out there. Or maybe everything that happened afterward was just a coincidence. But I still think about those footprints outside the cabin. Because even now, I can't come up with a good reason for someone to walk up to a remote vacation rental in the middle of the night and leave without saying a word. My name is Tyler Bennett. This happened during a summer vacation in northern Michigan when I was 20. A group of 6 of us rented a lake house for a week after finishing our sophomore year of college. It wasn't some wild spring break type trip. We mostly wanted to relax, fish, swim, and spend a few days away from campus before summer jobs started. The house sat at the end of a dirt road surrounded by woods. The nearest gas station was about 15 minutes away. The nearest town was even farther. For the first few days, everything was great. We spent our afternoons on the lake and our nights around a fire pit behind the house. The property next door looked abandoned. The driveway was overgrown, and the small cabin sitting there appeared empty. At least that's what we thought. On our 4th night, we were sitting around the fire when my friend Jake noticed a light inside the neighboring cabin. At first, we figured someone had finally arrived, but the light wasn't moving. It wasn't like somebody walking around. It was just a single light shining from one room. Nobody thought much of it. The next morning, while we were loading fishing gear into our truck, I happened to glance toward the neighboring property. The light was still on, in broad daylight. That seemed strange, but again, not alarming. That afternoon, we rented kayaks and spent several hours exploring the shoreline. When we got back, we found something odd. Our trash can had been moved. It normally sat beside the garage. Now it was near the road. None of us remembered moving it. We joked that maybe one of us had done it while drunk the night before. That explanation seemed good enough, until the following day, because that's when smaller things started happening. A folding chair that had been on the deck was suddenly missing. A cooler we left outside had been moved behind the house. One morning, Jake couldn't find his fishing tackle box. We searched everywhere. It eventually turned up under the deck. Nobody could explain how it got there. By then, we had started blaming each other. The assumption was that somebody was messing around as a prank, but nobody ever admitted to anything. The weirdest part was that things only happened overnight, never during the day. By the 6th night, everybody was a little uneasy, not scared, just confused. That evening, we decided to walk down to the dock and watch the sunset. While we were sitting there, my friend Nolan suddenly pointed toward the neighboring property. Someone was standing on the edge of the woods, watching us. The person was too far away to make out clearly. We waved. No response. After a few seconds, they stepped back into the trees. The moment felt strange, but not necessarily threatening. The neighboring cabin wasn't ours. Maybe whoever owned it didn't want strangers waving at them. We eventually forgot about it. Later that night, around 1 a.m., I woke up thirsty and went downstairs for water. As I passed through the kitchen, I noticed something outside. The motion light above the garage was on. I looked through the window. Nobody was there. The yard was empty. I figured an animal had triggered it. Then I noticed something else. The garage door was slightly open, only a few inches. I knew for a fact we'd closed it before bed. I didn't wake anybody. I just walked over and shut it. Then I went back to sleep. The next morning, I mentioned it to everyone. That's when Jake went completely pale. He told us he'd left his fishing rods inside the garage overnight. We checked immediately. They were gone. All 3 of them. At first, we thought maybe one of us had moved them. Nobody had. We searched the property. Nothing. The rods had simply disappeared. Now we were genuinely concerned. The owner of the rental property lived nearby, so we called him. When he arrived, we explained everything. The missing items, the moved furniture, the person in the woods, the garage, the neighboring cabin. The owner listened quietly. Then he asked a question. "Did you ever see a blue pickup truck?" We all looked at each other. Nolan said he'd seen one driving slowly down the dirt road a couple of nights earlier. The owner's face immediately tightened. Apparently, the neighboring cabin had been vacant for nearly 2 years. No electricity, no water, nobody living there. The light we'd seen wasn't supposed to be there. He explained that several renters had reported strange incidents over the previous few summers. Missing property, people snooping around at night, footprints around cabins, a few thefts, nothing violent, just enough to make people uncomfortable. The police had investigated several times, but never caught anyone. The owner believed someone had been using the abandoned cabin as a temporary hideout. That explanation made my stomach drop, especially when I remembered the light. That meant somebody had been in there the entire week, close enough to watch us, close enough to know when we left, close enough to walk onto the property whenever they wanted. We packed our things and left later that afternoon. Before leaving, I walked around the side of the house one last time. Near the tree line, I found something partially buried beneath leaves. Jake's missing tackle box. It was empty. Whoever had taken it had apparently gone through everything and tossed it aside. I never found out who was staying in that abandoned cabin. Maybe it was a homeless drifter. Maybe it was a thief looking for easy targets. Maybe it was someone who simply enjoyed watching vacationers who had no idea they weren't alone. What bothers me most is realizing how many nights we spent sitting around that fire, laughing, drinking, completely unaware that someone might have been watching us from less than 100 yards away the entire time. My name is Brandon Cole. This happened during a summer vacation in Oregon when I was 22. A few friends and I rented an Airbnb near Crater Lake for 5 days. The plan was simple: hiking during the day, campfires at night, and maybe a little fishing if we found a decent spot. There were 5 of us all together: me, my girlfriend Hannah, my friend Derek, his younger brother Sean, and our buddy Chris. The Airbnb was a small cabin sitting at the edge of a heavily wooded property. The owner lived over an hour away and managed everything remotely. The nearest neighbor was supposedly half a mile down the road. The first couple of days were great. The cabin was secluded, the weather was perfect, and there were plenty of trails nearby. Honestly, it was exactly the kind of vacation we needed. The weird stuff started on the 3rd day. We came back from a hike around sunset and found a pickup truck parked on the shoulder of the road about 100 yards from the cabin. That wasn't particularly strange. The area was popular with hikers. But what caught my attention was that the truck was empty. No driver, no passengers, nothing. Just sitting there. We didn't think much of it and went inside. The next morning, the truck was still there. Same spot, nobody around. Derek joked that somebody had probably broken down. That explanation made sense. Until later that afternoon. We were sitting on the back deck when Sean asked a simple question. "Have you guys been using the fire pit?" Everyone said no. The fire pit sat about 30 feet behind the cabin. We walked over to look. The ashes were fresh. Not warm, but definitely fresh. Someone had used it recently. The problem was none of us had. We figured maybe the cleaning crew had burned something before we arrived. Again, not a huge deal. Just a little odd. That night we had a few drinks and stayed up late playing cards. Around midnight, Chris stepped outside to make a phone call because reception was slightly better near the driveway. He came back inside a couple minutes later, looking confused. He asked if anyone else was staying nearby. We told him not that we knew of. Apparently, while he was outside, he heard somebody walking through the woods. Not an animal. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. He even called out to see if anyone was there. Nobody answered. The next morning, we woke up to find the pickup truck gone. Problem solved, or so we thought. Later that afternoon, Hannah realized she'd left her sunglasses on the deck overnight. When she went looking for them, they were gone. We searched everywhere. Nothing. A few hours later, Sean found them. They were sitting on a tree stump about 50 yards into the woods. At first, we accused him of moving them as a joke. He swore he hadn't. Honestly, I believed him. Sean wasn't really that kind of person. For the first time all trip, I started feeling uneasy. Not scared, just uneasy. That evening, we decided to drive into town for dinner. When we got back, it was already dark. As we pulled into the driveway, Derek suddenly hit the brakes. There was somebody standing near the side of the cabin. At least we thought there was. By the time our headlights reached the area, whoever it was had already disappeared into the trees. Nobody wanted to admit they'd seen it, but everybody had. The mood inside the cabin completely changed after that. We locked the doors, closed the blinds, and spent the rest of the night inside. Around 2 a.m., I woke up needing water. As I walked through the living room, I noticed something near the front porch. At first, I thought it was a package. Then I realized it hadn't been there earlier. I turned on the porch light. It was Hannah's missing sunglasses, just sitting in the middle of the welcome mat. I stared at them for several seconds. My stomach immediately dropped. Because there was no reasonable explanation. Someone had taken them, and someone had brought them back. I woke everyone up. Needless to say, nobody slept much after that. The next morning, we called the Airbnb owner. At first, he seemed annoyed. Then I mentioned the pickup truck, the footsteps, the sunglasses, the figure beside the cabin. There was a long pause. Then he asked me a question. "Did you find anything else moved around?" I told him about the fire pit. He got quiet again. Finally, he admitted something. The property had once belonged to his uncle. Years ago, before the Airbnb existed, his uncle had allowed hunters to camp on the land. Most stopped coming after the property was sold. Most. Apparently, every summer or two, somebody would report signs that an unknown person had been spending time somewhere in the woods behind the cabin. Nothing serious. No break-ins. No attacks. Just strange incidents. Missing items. Things being moved. Evidence that somebody had been nearby. The owner said the police had checked the area several times over the years, but never found anyone. After hearing that, we decided to leave a day early. While loading our cars, Chris walked into the woods one final time to make sure we hadn't forgotten anything. A few minutes later, he came back looking pale. He didn't say much at first. Then he showed us what he'd found. About 100 yards behind the cabin was a small clearing, hidden among the trees. There was an old camping chair, a cooler, several empty food containers, and a fire pit made from stones. Someone had been staying there recently, watching the cabin from a distance. We packed the cars in record time after that. To this day, I don't know who that person was. Maybe it was a homeless drifter. Maybe it was a hunter who refused to give up a place he'd been using for years. Or maybe it was someone who simply liked watching vacationers who had no idea they were being watched. What bothers me most isn't the footsteps or the figure we saw near the cabin. It's those sunglasses. Because whoever took them could have kept them, could have thrown them away. Instead, they brought them back and left them on the porch, just to let us know they had been there.